Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the AVPN webinar on practicing results-based finance on the ground. This is the second webinar in a series of 3 webinars that we'll be doing on this topic. My name is Kavita and I'm the Manager, Knowledge and Member Engagement at the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, AVPN India. AVPN is a unique funders network committed to building a high-impact philanthropy and social investment community across Asia. Currently, we have over 600 plus members across 59 countries, and we are very pleased to have two of our members based in India speaking today, along with one of our esteemed guests from US8 India. Representing COIS, we have Dr. Prabhu Tirupati, Principal, Serena Guarnas-Kelly, Partner, both from COIS, and Gautam Chakrabarti, Development Assistant Specialist, Health Finance at USAID. Prabhu, Serena, and Gautam will take us through the nuances of results-based financing and will give us examples of some successful case studies in India. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping instructions. We will not take any questions during the presentation, but will open up the floor for Q&A after the speakers have presented. But please feel free to use the console to type in your questions while the speakers are presenting, and I will raise the questions to our speakers in the Q&A sessions at the end. If you have further questions that are not answered by the end of the webinar, you can email us at india@avpn.asia. With great enthusiasm, I will now hand over the presentation to Prabhu.
Thanks, Kavita. Hi, everyone. I just thought we'll do a very quick intro of myself and Serena and hand over to Gautam, given we both were present in the first session. So like Kavita mentioned, Prabhu Tirupati, I work out of our Mumbai office, and I look at our healthcare work across innovative finance and impact investing.
Hi, my name is Serena Guarnas-Kelly. I'm a partner at COIS. At COIS, I oversee all of our innovative finance and blended finance work globally across a number of sectors. Over to Gautam.
Hi, I'm Gautam. I'm the Innovative Financing Specialist in the USAID office in India. I'm located out of the American Embassy in Delhi and look at various innovative financing, especially the impact bonds, the blended capital, the loan guarantees, and that kind of stuff, specifically focused on the health sector. Thanks.
Thanks, Gautam. So I just wanted to quickly recap what we did over session 1 2 weeks back, and then move on to the session today. So if you recall, last time we had spoken about, say, the introduction to innovative finance. We had a quick round of definition and the history of innovative finance, as Serena took us through where the word was coined, how it was coined, and why the transition to the term blended finance happened, and so on. Then we landed upon the 2 big use cases for innovative finance. One is how do you create more impact per philanthropic dollar spent, and the second is how do you leverage more capital from the private sector for every dollar spent. And I wanted to recap this also to once again reinforce the point that it's always important to start with why we are doing something and then moving to the solution, starting with whether you want to create more impact or bring more capital, and then look at the instrument accordingly so that you don't end up with the wrong solution. Having said that, today we wanted to focus on lever number 1, which is how do you create more impact per dollar. And that's what we're going to, I'm going to do that over a bit of definition and conceptually over the next 10 minutes before handing over to the 2 experts on the table, Serena, who was part of the quality education team in India, and Gautam, who was part of the structuring team at the Oakridge Impact Bond in India. Quickly moving on in terms of objectives of today's session, we wanted to start off with laying out the key objectives for results-based financing itself and introducing it. Quite briefly, the why of results-based financing, and then move on to the how of results-based financing, where we speak about some of the steps involved in structuring, but also illustrate it later on through two of those instruments that have happened in India. And the third part is trace some of the evolution of results-based financing as it has moved from impact bonds to pay for success instruments, and taking into account the local legal structure as well. So it's going to be a mix of quick conceptual discussions, but also quickly moving on to the illustration through actual instruments that have happened in India. And just to frame all of this, we spoke about, say, the big framework of innovative financing, but also want to spend time on what is results-based financing. A pretty broad definition, essentially given it's a very broad set of instruments and not just one instrument, but rather exemplifies an approach in itself. You could look at results-based financing as a set of mechanisms that link the funding or financing of programs to reaching certain outcomes. There has been quite a bit of discussion around results and the actual impact that's reached for the financing that has gone into the sector versus the leakage that has happened when you speak about impact financing. And as much as you put controls, we see that finance, or essentially going where the money is an important part of this toolkit, and linking it to the financial incentives is a big reason or big mechanism by which you could move systems towards results. And that's what the system's all about. And just speaking about why it's different from how it's happened always. As a traditional approach, there have been, say, funders who have provided financing, but it's always happened to the service provider directly without, say, an instrument in the middle, and which would then go on to delivering activities and reaching the target population. What RBF looks to do is put a layer into this, specifically with the financing part, where there probably is an upfront payment. And here I'm still making it, this is probably the commonest approach, where there's an upfront payment so that the service provider still has the project financing to start with. And as and when outcomes are being met, they will be reported on pre-agreed intervals, which then triggers further payments. So you essentially are linking the financing or the payments to the reaching of outcomes, milestones, or whatever the schedule you pick up is. And that essentially is the key driver, linking the financing to the outcomes when you speak about results-based financing. I think just going on to why or what are the reasons for which you should do it. Three major reasons, starting with one, increasing the accountability. Like I mentioned earlier, until now, a lot of financing has been towards inputs or rather activities. For example, how many health camps happened, how many beneficiaries were reached. But more and more systems are moving towards increasing that accountability when it comes to service providers. How do you make them accountable for not just health camps conducted, but actual health outcomes or even outputs? So I would say number one, this accountability is more in terms of the provider. The second is shifting the focus towards outcomes, which pertains more towards an ecosystem level. So this is more about how do you create frameworks for areas where systems are not fully geared towards outcomes. I think a prime example is something we'll discuss later when Serena picks up the quality education. But education is an area where outcomes frameworks weren't well established, specifically in India. 25% of, say, 14 to 16-year-olds still cannot read basic text fluently in their own language, which points to a lot of progress having been made in India in terms of access, thanks to the Right to Education Act, etc. But quality still being a key issue, which is where bringing that focus on outcomes and finding how do you move these systems towards outcomes is an ecosystem building effort. Of course, like I mentioned, we'll cover that in greater detail later on. A third big driver that we see is also risk sharing and capital conservation, which could do more towards the donors or towards, say, the set of stakeholders in themselves, where you divide risk and conserve capital by paying only for outcomes that are met. And if outcomes are not met, you don't really need to pay for it. And when I say risk sharing, one additional element to that is, if you are not paying for outcomes, that potentially leaves a service provider without future financing, thereby mechanisms like impact bonds evolved, where you essentially de-risk it for the implementer and say the upfront payment is going to be made by investors. So the risk of running out of funding doesn't happen for the implementers, and it's shared by the investors. The risk of meeting the outcomes is shared by, once again, the investor and the donor. So that essentially is three of the major objectives that we note when it comes to results-based financing. Pretty quickly, in terms of what this could really entail, how do you take all of these concepts and really apply it, and what are the set of tools that could help with this? I'm going to start with something that's not so commonly spoken about, but we think falls well within the realm of results-based financing, which is the area of value-based pricing that has been coming up in a lot of the healthcare world, the pharma world, where a given set of patients respond to treatment and a big portion don't respond. And how do you really price the product only for the value that's derived by the patient? So if patient A responds, they pay a given amount, and patient B who doesn't respond really doesn't need to pay because the medicine did nothing for them. The system of care did nothing for them. So that's one broader application that we see for RBF. The second is probably the simplest, but has been the most widely used, performance-based contracts. So while I did speak about outcomes in great detail earlier, if you do have systems where outcomes cannot be adequately measured, or the risk or the benefit to cost ratio of measuring outcomes versus putting together milestones is weighted towards milestones, then it makes sense to look at, say, performance-based contracts. And a good part of RBF so far has been around this area. However, some of these evolving mechanisms that have come up have been in the area of interest buy down. Once again, which is something Gautam will cover later, but wherein, say, the returns for a particular system currently are at 4%, but the expected return for an investor is around 10 to 11. So just by providing the 10 minus 4, you're able to create value chains, or you're able to create financing models where they previously did not exist because the risk return ratio was not favorable for an investor. So that essentially gives a significant leverage for donors in that space. The other additional element you could have is a principal buy down, where it's not as small a gap, but there's probably a bigger gap you need to fulfill, but it's still less than 100. So you pay a part of the principal and enable these risk reward mechanisms. The last and say most advanced of these are impact bonds. Once again, we are going to discuss these, but essentially in areas where there is need for shifting systems towards outcomes, where you need more complex instruments, then we look at impact bonds with very specific use cases. So that's a quick brief of where we see the applications of RBF and the different instruments you could use. Of course, just a caveat here before I hand over to Serena, this is more of a less of a comprehensive list and more of illustrative, just to show you that you could have different ways in which you achieve results and different levels of capital that you could put to use for achieving each of these.
Thanks, Prabhu. Moving over to give you a flavor, just like what we did with Innovating Finance and Blended Finance, about how results-based financing have been performing over time. And again, a very similar picture to what you've seen in the first session, with a results-based finance on the rise. To note, this is a cumulative graph, but the positive news is that just over the last decade, about $25 billion have been deployed through results-based finance. up from just a few billion in the previous decade. A little bit of context on the rise, even though there is a point where impact bonds are noted as new instruments. The lion's share of the 25 billion of the past decade is still driven largely to one financing windows at the World Bank, which is done through its performance for results instrument that accounts for about 19 billion of that 25. And then the other thing to note is that historically, the health sector has been also the lion's share of this results-based finance dollars, partly due, or I guess mostly due to the fact that the verifiability of data, particularly through hospitals as well as other health agencies, and the fact that data such as vaccinations is quite easily available and verifiable. And then lastly, on geographies where most of the money is being spent in sub-Saharan Africa and results-based finance, with second to Asia. And only a last point, if similar to some of the questions raised in the first session, if people are interested in actually seeing some of the breakdown of this data, either by instrument, by sector, by region, we have shared a web link with Kavita, who can provide it to anyone who's interested. Moving on, in the next session, we would like to briefly talk about, similarly to what we did in Innovating Finance, about how to think about designing and structuring a results-based financing instrument. The overarching principle is similar to what we suggested in the first session, is to start with the needs and the issue first, and only then think about a menu of instruments and the fit for purpose of, in this case, a subset of the Innovating Financing Toolkit that actually meets those needs. The second point that I'd like to make about feasibility, that it's a little bit more nuanced compared to what we said in Innovating Finance, is that given the link between the payment, so the financial results, and the underlying impact, very early on in the so at the feasibility stage, we do focus on the technical aspects, on the technical feasibility of the measurement, and in particular two areas. One are the outcomes that you care about measurable, and there's usually a lot of time spent in terms of translating the desires on the impact side into outcome metrics and the feasibility and the ease of collection of those outcome metrics. And then second, and just as importantly, the availability of benchmarks. Because when you talk about paying for results, ultimately for the funder, there is a bit of, I guess, partly existential, but mostly strategic question around how much are you willing to pay? And often, particularly public donors, but also philanthropic donors, need to think and come up basically with a form of pricing for the outcomes. So what is the value that they attribute? We'll see it particularly in the examples that Gautam and I will talk about. How much do you value, for example, for a child to improve their English and math abilities and reduce the gap in the grades? And so there's a bit of a question about how much is that worth to you as a funder, that requires not just the outcomes to be measurable, but also an ability to actually put a value on those outcomes. And this is where benchmarks, they can be historical for the service provider, or they can be across the sector, but some form of benchmarking about what is cost effectiveness, what is the value of these outcomes in that sector, which is often a challenge. And then the second point on feasibility is to look at legal aspects very early on. This is particularly tricky when there is a financial payment made to a for-profit or an investor, and perhaps the team might be able to comment on this later on, particularly the ability to use CSR money in through performance-based results, and in particular in impact bonds, and to test that very early on about when and how it is possible to actually tap into the sources. Most of the next steps after feasibility are very similar to what we talked about in Innovating Finance, so I'll talk about them more briefly. One is about, as I said, it's a toolkit. So think about the menu that are toolkit, and then compare and select the instrument before you go into structuring. And then finally, structuring the instrument itself, where again, a lot of the time, because it's a results-based finance and a lot of the emphasis is put on the payment metrics, actually goes into establishing the metrics, pricing the metric, and establishing a monitoring and evaluation framework that will support and trigger the payments. I will probably stop here because I think a lot of this will come to life as we go through the examples. And so I will hand over to Gautam, perhaps to go through the first example.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. So if we look at the first example, which is talking about the Utkrisht impact bond, focused on reducing maternal deaths and neonatal deaths in the state of Rajasthan. So I'll just go through this diagram. It talks about 5 steps. So I'll just go through it. But before that, this entire impact bond is really aimed at ultimately leading to maternal lives saved. But intermediary outcome is having some hospitals improving their quality, which is measured through them getting quality accreditation. So the focus is on approximately 400 small and medium-sized hospitals in the state of Rajasthan, mainly operating in the smaller towns and tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities, where the bulk of the load is, because in the bigger cities or where there are, say, larger corporate hospitals or larger private hospitals, or even the government hospitals, they do have support in terms of improving their quality. But the small hospitals, which are very either in the suburbs or in the smaller towns, really don't have that kind of assistance to really help them through a quality accreditation process. So what we thought was, to save lives, we will have to ensure a better quality in these smaller hospitals, which don't normally get the assistance in improving their quality. So therefore, we thought of this impact bond structure, because earlier also we had been doing quality improvement in hospitals, but mostly we end up with, say, 75% or 80% success, and we are pretty happy about it. But even that means 20% loss of our investment. So we thought, why not investor takes the risk in producing the outcome, and we pay only when the outcome is there, thereby ensuring that 100% of our investment meets the outcome. So in the Utkrisht case, what happens is it's a UBS Optimus Foundation, so not the bank, but their foundation, which makes an investment with the implementing partners, which includes PSI, Palladium, and HLA-PPT. So they get very similar to grants. So but 80% of their cost is reimbursed. So 20% is still the partners are putting in as kind of risk, but 80% risk is shared by UBS. So they put in the money, and this money is used by PSI, HLA-PPT, and Palladium to provide technical assistance to these smaller hospitals that I talked of, usually 50 beds or near, say, ranges between 10 to 50 bedded hospitals, to help them getting prepared for quality accreditation. So the hospitals actually have to invest their own money to improve the infrastructure or put in place some patient safety systems and things like that. Also the fees to the quality accreditors like the NABH or the Manyata certifiers, so they pay the fee, hospitals pay the fee. So the only cost that is borne by this program through UBS investment is the technical assistance that goes into these hospitals. Now, once these hospitals are ready for certification, there's a third party which comes in, that is the step 3, a third party which comes in, that is Mathematica, and verifies that yes, the hospitals that the partners claim have reached the certification level have actually reached the certification level. So once the Mathematica verifies that yes, the claim is right, then they submit the report, the verification report, to us, along with the claims report of the partners. And us means it's the USAID and Merck for Mothers together. So essentially what USAID and Merck for Mothers are doing is underwriting the entire risk of UBS in case the success is achieved. That is, the hospitals are ready for accreditation. In case it is not, then the risk is completely borne by the UBS. But in case it is, then the entirety of the investment is paid back by USAID and Merck for Mothers together. So we between us pay 50% of the cost of the total thing. So a little beyond these steps, what happens is this might look a bit complicated, and actually these arrows in a way represents the number of contracts. So there is one contract between the investor and the implementing partner. There is one understanding between the implementing partner and the hospitals. There is a contract between Merck and Mathematica for the third-party verification. And there is contract between the outcome funders, that is USAID and Merck, with the UBS. So these are all different contracts that have to be prepared and signed simultaneously. But it might sound complicated. It is actually not, because once you look at the program totality, so all these contracts are basically elements of the complete picture. So once you develop the complete picture, it is really not that complicated. But yes, preparing the complicated picture takes some time. And it is also a negotiation between what the outcome funders like USAID want is like saving lives, whereas an investor can't really put money for saving lives, because lives might not be saved because of so many other reasons. So then there is always a negotiation, and this is the result of that negotiation, where we agreed that okay, instead of saving lives, we will pay for a hospital being ready for certification. So given this, and that is where I will go into the next slide also a little later. So given this, what we realized was, one, this might look good as a financial instrument, but purely as a development agency, we somewhere feel a bit unsatisfied, because a hospital which is ready for certification does not necessarily mean that lives will be saved for the years to come. Also, a hospital that gets certification this year, not necessarily they will continue in the next year or beyond. So how can this be sustained more? And therefore, what we felt was, one, for an instrument like a DIB, we would need an outcome which is a complete end by itself. There should not be any scope of something further to add on. So it should be a complete end by itself. And also, it should be which is non-controversial in a way, because quality improved in a hospital doesn't necessarily mean all lives would be saved, because people do die. But then if we make payment for the hospital, does that mean that we are assuring nobody will die? So it becomes a bit controversial. But for example, if we go to the next slide, what we try to do is, say for TB. Now, a case of TB, what we are trying to do in MP is kind of a hybrid impact bond. I would say hybrid because as you see here, the total investment that is needed is 2 to 3 million, but total outcome funding would be in the range of 5 to 7 million, a part of which would be paid by USAID. And what we are guaranteeing in the state of MP is for 15 districts is we will bear the interest cost, and if there is a performance bonus. So this is some sort of an instrument called SSN, Social Success Note, where the outcome funder pays the interest component. Because what we found in the context of India, CSR can't really take care of interest, because then it becomes a business proposition. So CSR can really take care of the cost of a social activity, but not really the interest. So we are guaranteeing covering the interest as a social success note for us. But for CSR and the government of MP, which comes in later, it would be a impact bond. So in case of CSR, it will be a development impact bond. When the MP government pays, it will be a social impact bond for them. So therefore, we are calling it a hybrid, because for the MP government, it's a social impact bond. For CSR, it will be a development impact bond. For USAID, it will be a social success note. So in this situation, what we are trying to do is assure that patients who complete treatment also gain weight as per the clinically approved standard, because what is happening currently is hardly 3% of the patients gain weight. So all those who don't gain weight but complete treatment don't really get cured, and they are more likely to get back TB again, which will be a drug-resistant TB, and in that case, the likelihood of death also increases. So if we just assure this support for weight gain through proper nutrition, that itself leads to a big jump in the resultant outcome. So what we are getting here, and why this is more suitable for this hybrid kind of impact bond, is one, a patient who gets treated and completes treatment is very much verifiable. because it is the government of MP which provides the treatment through the National TB Control Program, and it has a portal which so therefore there won't be an additional cost of a third party doing verification. It will already be there in the portal, and so the cost of verification and monitoring and evaluation also comes down. Secondly, what happens is a patient who has completed treatment is a complete outcome by itself. Nothing further is needed. And patient who gains weight by say 6 kgs, which is clinically acquired, can also be measured. So one, it can be measured. It can be done within 6 months time frame. It can be verified with very little cost. And therefore, we found that this kind of instrument is more suitable rather than the previous example where it not only much more complicated, but a lot of things are not verifiable. So given this, we have already started the implementation in one district in MP and also signed the MOU with the government of MP. So currently, they are not only providing the support for TB, but also making available the data, which will help us in verification. And after the pilot phase in one district, the state of MP is more likely to become the outcome funder. So this is here the risk investor is actually the child fund, which is the implementing partner itself. So again, this is very different from a traditional impact bond because you don't have a separate investor and a separate implementing partner. Here, the implementing partner itself is taking the risk, and they have mobilized money. So if they don't produce result, they will lose out the money. So basically, they are taking the liability of whatever loan or funds on their own books. So this is one case. Another case that we are trying in the neighboring state of Chhattisgarh is ensuring that there is improved TB case reporting. So currently what is happening is many patients who have symptoms of TB are not really screened, and those who are screened also are not fully screened in the sense they are not always screened for the drug sensitivity. And therefore, although the government is treating them, government doesn't know whether they are drug resistant. So what we are trying to do here is all people who come with symptoms of TB, coughing and all those things in the government hospitals, we ensure that 100% of these people undergo the full range of screening, including drug sensitivity. And therefore, when they are put on treatment, they are put on treatment as per the sensitivity, either as drug resistant case or drug normal TB regime. So this again, USAID would be taking care of the interest component, CSR would take care of the cost component, and Chhattisgarh state government is likely to come in as a outcome funder a little later after the investment. So total 2 to 3 million of outcome funding is what we are looking at. And the implementing partner here would be a big reputed TB institution known worldwide, Union. Now, Union not only will put in their money, they will also raise some money from the field. So here we really don't have at this point whether Union would bear the entire risk of the investment or it will be a grant to Union by some other risk investor. So this is still under process, but that is the program. So with all this, what I would really like to emphasize here is, as you see, what we have moved on from the earlier Utkrish, where the outcome, although is very measurable in terms of a hospital getting certified, this does not necessarily lead to a complete outcome in terms of lives saved. So there is no guarantee a certified hospital will always lead to saved lives and there won't be any deaths. Number two, in the Utkrish, if you see the outcome funder, the investor, the third-party verifier, all are foreign agencies. So given this, we really wanted to try out models which suit the Indian condition. And therefore, like in this case of MP Nutrition Hybrid Bond, the USAID India team would be one of the outcome funders, but it will be the local CSR, the local government, child fund who operates in India and raise their own money. So things are local. It's a complete outcome by itself in terms of so many patients getting not only completing treatment, but also gaining weight as per the need. So I think we have just started, but we feel this would be more successful as compared to the Utkrish Impact Bonds. I will stop there, and if there are any questions, I'll take it later. Thanks.
Thank you, Gautam. Maybe we'll move on to the last case study before we open up for questions. And as Prabhu mentioned, we wanted to talk about a second example of results-based finance with its application in India, which is the quality education DIB. Prabhu already shared some of the context. When it comes to education in India, access is really not the issue anymore. There's been tremendous progress where there are very high levels of access, particularly in primary education in India. But the huge gaps, significant gaps still remain when it comes to quality with kids, for example, in grade 6, still reading and performing in math at the level of grade 4. And so this was, again, as a starting point to think about results-based finance, very quickly and early on, focusing on where the gaps are, which was quality, not access. With quality being a little bit more complex. With access, you can count the kids. You can even think about kids that remain in class through attendance. Quality is a little bit trickier, but it is for where the gaps are. So I designed this about 3.5 years ago. It was a partnership between UBS, who was interested in playing a role as a social investor, and the British Asian Trust, who saw themselves as an intermediary and a convener with a lot of technical expertise and programmatic focus on education in India. Where we designed an impact bond that built on the success of the Educate Girls, the very first development impact bond ever designed, that was at the time of the design of this DIB, was already showing successful results for the first year and a half of operation. So there was a desire to build on the success of that and to think about now scaling the first impact bond into an impact bond fund that would be able to actually finance, scale the first pilot and finance multiple service providers across different geographies. So the impact bond structure on this page is one that should now be familiar to you. The only thing perhaps to add are just a couple of partners to the impact bond launch. With the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation playing as the anchor outcome funder, but many other partners joining in, such as DFID, BT, and other foundations providing grants, either as outcome funds or grants for the research and evidence. And then a third-party evaluator, Grey Matters, that has built track record and data for what I discussed previously to help us benchmark programmatic effectiveness across different service providers. So moving on to the next page, the crux of the matter, particularly in quality of education, was about setting the targets. So one was the scope that was actually given by the size of the impact bond that we aimed to raise between 8 and 10 million and landed, I think, fundraising for about 9.6, where the scope was to serve 200,000 student beneficiaries. What was interesting here is that while we were building on the example of the Educate Girls, there was a desire to actually serve this 200,000 students through a different menu of programmatic interventions. So in addition to the Educate Girls program, we wanted to test other models, and some of them with perhaps a less direct impact on children, such as, for example, one model that we included was training the teachers as a way to then improve the quality of education in the classroom, but still looking at also very high touch models, and as a result, more expensive models such as supplementary education, which is, for example, provided to children after they leave school and bringing the kids back into a classroom or a coaching kind of environment, which tends to be more high touch. So I think the idea that we tested here, a little bit different, was can we create a fund where the metric of success is the same. It's about improving the quality of education, where the metric is about improved learning outcomes as is measured through test, but not choose the program pathway itself, but rather create different programmatic pathways. The challenge then became about, if that's the case, if you include training the teachers, which is very indirect, with supplementary training, how do you set a price? And this is what I was referring before about the not just the ability to actually measure through testing improvement of education for children, but also then be able to say, so how much would I pay for the change in the outcome, and how much should that be related to the directness, to the programmatic pathway that I choose? And what we found is that education was a very good starting point, because there was a lot of evidence on the effectiveness of different programmatic interventions. So there were a couple, well, not too many, but at least compared to other sectors that we more recently worked in, there were some meta-literature reviews about programmatic effectiveness. The tricky part remained that none of those studies covered cost effectiveness. And so we were left a little bit with a question about how much should we pay for a change is called in the effect size, so the change in improved education through a training of teachers program, which is cheaper. How much should we then pay instead relative to a supplementary program? And so the choice was to design it as a fund, but then with the funders, the outcome funders and investor, create room for the fund itself to basically go through a price discovery process. So we set some targets. That was our best interpretation of the evidence around setting appropriate targets for each programmatic intervention. So it was our best guess, but then set up the fund in a way that there could be learning through the first 3 years of the fund, and before scaling to the next fund, so this is 10 million with an idea to then scale it to 100 million, take stock about what the evidence has been through the payment of the impact bond in terms of the relative prices. And so this is what we called a little bit like one of the objectives about evidence building was about price discovery on the cost effectiveness of different programmatic interventions to improve quality of education. I would perhaps conclude with what's on the right-hand side. So I really talked about the impact as it pertains to learning outcomes and translating quality outcome into a quantitative measure through tests. And we were lucky to work with some of the technical providers that had long expertise, both BAT as well as the funders in terms of funding education, and also with Great Matters in terms of having track record and databases that we could benchmark the test results again. But then other also objectives of this for an impact was bringing in new players. Obviously, UBS, BAT, and the Dell Foundation have been funders in this space for long experience, but they were able through partnerships to bring in other, particularly corporate partners as well, that have been supporting education, but perhaps not through a results-based finance mechanism. And then there was also, I guess, an aspiration in terms of the sustainability of the fund, both to engage the government initially at the policy level, but hopefully over the longer term as a potential funder, similarly to what has been happening in some of the European markets and in South Africa and in other markets, with the government at least partly paying for some of these outcomes, as well as through evidence building to be able to share and improve, particularly from the policy level and the evidence level, the future funding of education. Perhaps I'll stop here and I'll hand over Kavita to help us facilitate any questions about the presentation.
Thank you, Serena. I can already see a lot of questions that have come up. We will start with the first question. What is the motivation for an outcome funder to join the results-based funding?
Can I take that?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, because we are the outcome funder. So for us, the real motivation is having greater bang for the buck. because as I was mentioning, we had been doing similar activities earlier also as purely grant funded mode. And in those cases, even a 85% or 80% success would be considered a big success. But even that would mean a 15 to 20% loss of our investment. Whereas in a results-based financing mode, we pay only if there is a success. So whatever we are paying, and especially USAID being a government of US body, so we are answerable to the taxpayers' money. So every taxpayers' money that we pay in an impact bond is accounted for in terms of an outcome achieved or a quality improved or a TB patient cured. So what I would say is that is really the motivation, that every money that we pay goes for success. The added benefit is it actually improves the efficiency also, because in a grant funded mode, the focus is on the activities and not so much on cost savings. But here the investor gets some return only if the cost is under control. And therefore, we did end up with at least a 10% reduction as compared to our grant funded activity for similar activities. So I believe these two would be the major motivations.
Right. And Gautam, the next question is also for you. What is the status of the TB nutrition bond and when is it due to be launched?
I didn't get it fully. You dropped on in between. Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah. So the question is, what is the status of the TB nutrition bond and when is it due to be launched?
Okay, the TB nutrition bond has already started implementation in one district, and over the period of next 3 years, we plan to take it to 15 districts. So one district is already started, but we are actually looking for partners both for investment as well as for outcome funding to support us in scaling this to 15 districts. Because part funding will be there from the MP government, but part funding, it actually costs around 10 to 12,000 rupees per TB patient to be fully supported for nutrition. So it's more like sponsoring so many patients, each patient 10 to 12,000 rupees. So that is what we are looking for as some support.
Okay, and the next question, which is related. Okay, do you want to please complete?
No. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so the next question is related to it. And the question is, what metrics would be used to measure the TB nutrition hybrid impact bond? Would it be just the completion of the intervention or weight gain?
It's both. And it's a dual metric, means the patient should have completed treatment. And at the time of completion of treatment, the weight gain as compared to when they started the treatment should be at least 6 kgs for adult. Actually, it's different age bands have different weight gains. There's a standard metric, but the TB control program of India has this standard that people who join in and what level of weight should gain how much. So when they start their treatment, the government already takes weight, and when they complete, we will ensure that the weight is taken. Meanwhile, we are also supporting them for nutrition, so we will also keep on taking weight in between. So the metric is a combination of these two: completion of treatment and gained weight by at least 6 kg.
Okay, wonderful. I can actually see a lot of hands raised. I just want to reiterate to the attendees that please type in your questions so that I can see them and raise it to the speakers. The next question is for you, Serena. Given the expected rate of return, why has scale-up of these models been so challenging?
Oh, very good question. So first, a caveat that there is a whole range of instruments out there with very different terms. However, I think most of the performance-based finance that we know of lend around some of the interest rates that I talked about with some capital guarantee, which make them, you're right, relatively attractive, particularly because a lot of these instruments are completely decorrelated with other potential investments available on the market. What we found is that the first and foremost challenge right now to the growth of results-based finance is the availability and, in quote, the securitization of outcome funds. As Gautam also described, there's a lot of desire, particularly between public funders, to move towards a more efficient and more effective use of their funds. However, in a lot of cases, the mechanics, so particularly budget allocation, the ability to underwrite new type of contracts, even though performance-based grants are not really new to public donors, the terms, particularly when they involve a payment to an investor, are a bit still quite a mini revolution, I think, in public sector terms. And so the availability of these funds, as well as the speed at which they can be secured against an instrument, still tend to be probably less than what the market would be ready for. I think there's a lot of work in terms of implementing partners, intermediaries, and I think there's now a very interesting group of investors that are looking to invest in some of these instruments. And I think also perhaps I would mention that at the global level, and I don't know, Gautam, if you want to add a few words on this, there are also, in addition to what I described about the World Bank, within public agencies such as USAID and DFID, but also amongst some of these public donors, there is now a desire to coordinate and move more funding towards this, but I would describe it as still happening.
And the next question is again for you, and I think even Gautam, you can chip in. How expensive was it to design the various projects, and how did the parties recover the cost?
Yeah, very good, great question. I think this touches upon some of the lessons learned that we described in Innovating Finance. So there was a big difference between the very first development impact bond, the Educate Girls one, and the quality of education. The Educate Girls being the very first one of its kind, even the very first development impact bond, the design and the M&E costs were quite high. In fact, they were higher than the outcome funds that were distributed. And I think it was partly criticized for it. I have a more pragmatic view. Whenever you're trying to do something innovative, it is going to be more expensive. Having said that, the second impact bond, and then most of the impact bonds or other sophisticated results-based finance instruments that we design, they tend to be expensive, but we try to benchmark the cost of the design and structuring to be about not more than 10% of actual fund size, which puts a lot of, and this is all including even M&E, which tends to be, as I've described in the approach, quite an expensive part. And obviously this puts an emphasis of doing bonds of a certain size. So nothing less than 5 million can be cost efficient, ideally around 10 million, which is how we anchor the quality of education one. And then ideally through evidence, for example, as I said, in the quality of education, we had some very difficult evaluation questions around the metric and the evidence. But as the fund scale, obviously this cost would be seen as fixed costs of the first fund. And some of this cost can be recouped by being included in the budget, which means that when the outcome funders pays back, they can also cover some of these design costs. And overall, paying 10% for design, structuring, fund management, and evaluation, I think is still, in terms of benchmarks compared to a grant, I think it still makes some of these instruments potentially attractive. But again, there's quite a range. Some are more complex than others. Some take a lot more time and so on. So I'm just talking about averages, hoping to give a feel about they're expensive, yes, but I still think they're within the range of what you would expect from an M&E perspective or a fixed cost perspective to some of the grants. And they, as Gautam said, because you only pay when you have results, they can actually be more efficient.
I can just chip in with some very hard data. For the Oakridge Impact Bond, which is around $8 million, the entire impact bond, it took us almost like 3 years to do it through a technical assistance grant of 1 million. So it costed us 1 million to put it in place over a period of 3 years for 8 million. But subsequently, the TB impact bond took us a little over 1 year and a cost of $400,000. And also in the Oakridge one, the M&E cost is around 10% of the total, whereas in the TB impact bond, it is less than 3% of the total. So I believe there is a learning curve. As you go along, you become more efficient.
Wonderful. Prabhu, there's one question for you. You touched upon usability of impact bonds versus other RBF instruments only in certain cases. What might some of those be?
Hi, Kavita. Once again, great question. And I think this is something Gautam, Serena, and I have been going through over the past 2, 3 years as we've looked at different providers, different scenarios, and looking to apply impact bonds versus other instruments. I think it's a combination of factors, I'd say, about whether you really need to do an impact bond versus simpler instrument, and slowly putting those blocks one on top of the other, starting off with the simplest. In this case, it could be, say, milestone-based financing, right? You start off with that and look at whether there is a huge need for upfront working capital, which is something that could point towards an impact bond. But if not there, you don't really need to venture further. If the, say, payments to the implementer are going to happen month after month or year after year. The second thing to look at is probably the implementation risk. Is there really a big a risk in terms of implementation that essentially then needs to be de-risked for the implementer by bringing an investor? If not, once again, you could start off with the simplest instrument and go ahead. I think the third point to speak about is specifically on the area of outcomes, where number one, are there outcomes that are measurable, which will lend itself to even the simplest outcomes-based instrument? And secondly, what is the cost of measuring it? Because like Gautam mentioned, say a 10% cost for an M&E is quite high when you look at any instrument. And although right now it's come down to 3%, that is essentially the big question we need to ask, which is, is the cost benefit of measuring it worth it? Or are we better off looking at a slightly distanced RBF, like say an output, or in some cases even an input-based mechanism? If there's adequate linkage to the outcome, you're better off measuring that and expending that money towards actual implementation rather than M&E. So those would be factors I think of when looking at a simpler instrument and going towards a complex instrument. And once again, to reiterate, the key would be to look at start simple and put those building blocks on top of it. If you want working capital, then look at a different mechanism. If you want to de-risk it, then look at a different mechanism. The simplest example I'd give is this. If you are, in terms of scale up, if your implementer is solely dependent on these funds for their scale up, then it's a significant risk once again. So you should bring in an investor, as opposed to if this is just 10% or 5% of the total revenues, or rather the financial inflows for the implementer, they're much more diversified. So you could still have a multi-year contract with specific milestones or outcomes, outcome targets set year after year, and pay them only for reaching those outcomes. So in that case, you're still not putting a considerable burden on the implementer. So it basically comes down to many of these factors, whether there is adequate data and you need to push that system towards outcomes, whether there's a need for upfront financing in there, whether there's a significant risk that needs to be taken care of.
Okay, the next question is, what are the best practices in engaging the Government of India to come on board as outcomes funder?
I think it's probably more a question for Gautam, and I'd probably add my own question on top of this as well. So it would be interesting to hear the experience, specifically with respect to the PFS mechanism. And given quite a bit of the health subject comes under the state, how's your experience been, say, managing the state and essentially bringing them into a PFS mechanism?
Right. Yeah, let me actually chip in here. I don't know if I can answer it in a short thing. Number one, more than the government of India, it's the state governments that has to be looked into for outcome funding, because most of the development sector activities are in the state list, and Implementation is the state government responsibility, whereas central government is more like a facilitator. Although as USAID, we are in talks with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to help create some kind of a fund through public sector CSR, which can, because there is this direction from the Prime Minister's office to direct all the most of the CSR into education and health and water sanitation. So if we can create some kind of fund, but that is a talk that is going on. If that happens, that would be the outcome funding. But as we come to the state governments, I really see many state governments like MP, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, they are very enthusiastic about it. They actually want to roll out social impact bonds. It will be social because it's the government paying. The problems are, I think, mainly two, which needs to be solved, or three problems. The first problem is the government finds it difficult to keep aside money from the current budget for future payment. That is a bit tricky in a government budget scenario. Second, what happens in a outcome-based payment scenario is you lose track of the audit trail, because normally when you audit, you know how much money has gone into salaries, how much for consumables, how much for community activities. But if you pay an outcome fixed fund, it is difficult to, because you're paying post facto. So for government, it becomes difficult to have an audit trail if they pay post facto. But then it is not really new for the government, because in the infrastructure sector, they had been doing this. And in fact, I was last week in MP, where there was a workshop on alternate financing, and health, education, nutrition, and agriculture secretaries actually suggested to the chief minister to start social impact bonds. So I see that the government is very open, but government will need help in how to create a fund where they can take money out of the current budget and pay future, how they can develop an audit trail. And the third problem that the government will face is tendering, because impact bond is co-created. It cannot be really tendered out, whereas for the government, co-creation would mean some sort of sole sourcing. Now, therefore, it's easier for the government to take on an existing impact bond and scale it up rather than uh, create a new impact bond. So these would be my initial reactions from my interaction with various state governments.
In the interest of time, I'm going to just take a one last question. That's again for you, Gautam. Is there a control group used in the TB nutrition bond? How do you think about counterfactual?
Uh, that is a good question, but I think in the TB nutrition bond that we are trying in MP, we really don't need a counterfactual, because the patient is anyway under treatment with the government. What we are doing is ensuring some kind of nutrition support through advocacy, as well as ensuring food packets rich in protein and all that. We did a pilot before starting this in a few blocks, and there we found that in the control group, where there was no intervention, only 3% patients gained weight, although they completed the TB treatment. Whereas where our intervention was going on in the pilot phase, 75% of the patients gained weight who had completed treatment. So that itself shows that there's a huge jump that is possible. And therefore, what we have built up is there would be two kinds of outcome payment. One would be per patient. So any patient who completes treatment and has gained weight would be the implementer would get some payment. But if in totality the percentage of patients who gain weight crosses 70%, there would be a performance bonus, because we saw that although it's 3% currently, but if you intervene, 70% is easily achievable. So performance bonus will kick in if it goes beyond 70%. But no, there is no case control thing, and we are really not measuring an impact here. It is on outcome that we are paying. It's only for impact that we would need a case control thing.
Thank you, Gautam. We have a lot of more questions that will not be able to take up due to time constraints. But I assure all the people who have asked the questions that in the next webinar, which will be happening in March, we will certainly take up these questions and answer them for you. So thank you everyone for participation in this interesting session. As I had mentioned earlier, this is a 3-part series, and we'll be doing the next webinar in March. If you have any questions that you want us to answer, or if there are any specific information you're looking for that is related to this topic, please feel free to let us know at india@avpn.asia. We will try and incorporate those in the next webinar. As Serena had mentioned, that she has shared a link with me, which gives you the data regarding all the instruments shown today. And what I'll do is I'll email that link to all the attendees who are here today. Thank you very much, Prabhu, Serena, and Gautam. We'll post the webinar recording on our website by next week. Please look out for it. And the AVPN Conference 2020 is being held at Singapore from 9th to 12th June. The theme of the conference is the power of networks. We'll be covering many interesting discussions regarding social funding and investment in Asia. The registration is now open. Please visit conference@avpn.asia and register. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for joining.